Are you a business owner? Emirate Radio gives the opportunity for infant organization and commercials for advertisement and publicity on our varieties of shows and update for the growth and expansion of your commodity. Grab the opportunity today by sending a mail to info@emiratesradio.ng. Call 0913 4158 376 or 0806 134 6946. Visit Emirate Radio House behind Federal Ministry of Environment off Old Jebba Road, Ilorin, Kwara State, Nigeria. Emirate Radio, the voice of the people.
Tips on how to be intentional on living a crime-free life. We give you tips on how to be informed of things around you, to be able to make informed decisions, to be able to know what the law says about your rights and obligations as citizens of Nigeria. My name is Damilola Obadimeji, your host on this program. And so on today's episode of Legal Clues, our topic for discussion will be violence against persons. Violence against persons. We all know what violence means, but for the purpose of those who might not know, I would like to say that violence is intentional use of physical force or power, threatened or actual, against oneself or another person, or against a group or a community, that can either result in or has a high likelihood of resulting in injury, death, psychological harm, maldevelopment, or deprivation. So as you all know, violence is inflicting harm or injury on either yourself or another person that can result, of course, in injury, death, psychological harm, deprivation, or maldevelopment. And of course, you know that violence can be perpetrated against anybody. We have different types of violence, ranging from physical violence to verbal violence to psychological violence. So violence include infliction of injury on people. Generally speaking, violence are actions that are intended or likely to hurt people or cause people damage. So who can be a victim of violence? Anyone can be a victim of violence, regardless of your age or your race or your gender or your sexual orientation or your faith or even your class, your social class. Anyone can be a victim of violence. It therefore means that children, women, adults, men, young or old, can all be victims of violence. Today we'll be talking mostly on violence against women and children, that some people call gender-based violence. Violence against women and children, which can be, of course, gender-based violence. Gender-based violence can be said to be any act of violence, any violent act at all perpetrated against a woman or a girl that results or is likely to result in physical, sexual, or psychological harm or suffering to that woman or the girl, whether it occurs in private life or in public life. So that is to say that violence against women and girls can happen in private life, in the family, or in the public life, even outside of the family. We have different types of violence that can be perpetrated against women and girls. It ranges from one I categorize to be intimate partner violence. Of course, we know these are behaviors by an intimate partner or ex-partner that causes physical, sexual, or psychological harm. Of course, it could include physical aggression, sexual coercion, psychological abuse, and controlling behaviors. Now, some of the examples of violent acts that can be perpetrated against women and girls are ranging from domestic violence. I'm sure a lot of people might have been hearing domestic violence from one quarter or the other. Some will know the meaning, some will not. In a general time, I can say that domestic violence occurs within the private and domestic sphere, generally between individuals who are either related by blood or intimacy. Of course, it could include acts of violence such as slapping, cooking, burning, sexual violence, and a host of others. So domestic violence, I define it as a pattern of behavior in any relationship that is used to gain or maintain power and control over an intimate partner. It could include, like I said earlier, physical, sexual, emotional, economic, or psychological actions or threats of actions that influence another person. So it means any behavior that frightens someone or that intimidates the person, or sometimes that terrorizes or manipulates or humiliates or blame or injure or even cause wound on somebody. So domestic violence ranges from actions like that. And there are ways you are going to know that this person is going through domestic violence. Some signs that you will see. For example, it ranges from embarrassment or making fun of a partner in the presence of friends and family. We have some husbands, for example, that will talk down on their wives. They will insult the wives even in the presence of family members, friends, just to humiliate the wife, just to intimidate the wife to silence, and a host of others. It can also mean intimidation or threat to gain compliance. Some people will intimidate their spouse just to make them do what they want. You understand? Intimidation or threat to gain compliance. Another form or sign of domestic violence could be malhandling of a partner. Either slapping, beating, and a host of others. It could also, involve drugging a partner to have carnal knowledge or control over such partner. This is also a form or a sign of domestic violence. Of course, financial or economic abuse sometimes is a sign of domestic violence. And again, lastly I have here, I said sexual abuse. Sexual abuse is also a form or a sign of domestic violence. All these signs that I mentioned, if you're going through one or another, you should know that you are in an abusive relationship, and that is all for the things and a lot more that forms what we call domestic violence. So domestic violence is a form of abuse or violence against a person, particularly women and girls. Another form of abuse that I have here is sexual abuse or rape. Sexual abuse is forcing someone to take part in sexual act without the person's consent. Where you force somebody to take part in a sexual act with you without the person's consent. It is, having intentional, unlawful carnal knowledge of a person when the other person does not consent, or where the consent is obtained by force or by means of threat. We have a lot of people, that will want to rape the other person, sometimes using force, using weapons. A lot of things can be done, to gain forceful consent of the other person. It could be by intimidation or by fear or harm by fear of harm, or by false and fraudulent misrepresentation. All these are ways in which a person can force the other person to have carnal knowledge of that person. Is a form of sexual abuse. So generally speaking, any act of conduct that violates, or humiliates or degrades the sexual integrity of a person can be said to be sexual abuse. Of course, sexual abuse, example of sexual abuse are rape, sexual harassment, cyber flashing, spiking, sexual assault. Rape is when you have carnal somebody without the person's consent, like I said, or where you obtain that consent forcefully. The person did not give the consent freely, but you obtained it forcefully by intimidating the person or coercing the person into, having sexual knowledge of the person. Sexual harassment, it might not be the act. Some people are fond of just, tapping. For example, someone will just tap women anyhow, touch women, anyhow without the person's consent is a form of sexual harassment. Cyber flashing, where some people send videos or pictures of their nudes to another person without the person's consent is a form of sexual abuse. If you don't know, you might think you're not physically assaulting the person or physically having carnal knowledge of the person, but when you send your nude to another person without the person's consent is a form of cyber flashing, which is a form of sexual abuse. We have spiking. Some people will spike another person's drink just to force the person to be unconscious and to have carnal knowledge of the person. And of course, sexual assault, where you sexually assault somebody. All these are form of sexual abuse. So sexual abuse is also a form of violence against persons, particularly women and children. Another form of violence is physical abuse. This is a intentional bodily injury on another person, inflicting intentional bodily injury on another person. So any act that attempts to cause or result in pain or in physical injury is a form of physical abuse. You're listening to Legal Clues on Emirate Radio. We want you to sit back, relax, and we will be right back. You're welcome back to Legal Clues on Emirate Radio, and as you know, we are talking about violence against persons, particularly women and children. So we are discussing some forms of violence that can be, perpetrated upon women and children. We have talked about physical abuse, we have talked about sexual abuse, we have talked about domestic violence. So all these are forms of violent acts that can be, inflicted on women and children. Of course, it could be inflicted on men too, but today we are concerned and talking particularly on women and children. So after all these things we've mentioned as a cord, there are some effects that abuse can have on the victim. There are some effects that abuse can have on the victim. It ranges from, some of the effects of abuses on the victim ranges from hospitalization. The person can be hospitalized, after being inflicted with injuries. It could be menial ones, it could be grave one, and the person can end up in the hospital. That's part of the effect. It can lead to death or injury. There's some cases that victims of abuses are found dead. You understand? There are some cases that the perpetrator does not even mean or intend to kill the person, but it happens. So it could result to death. It could result to infection and diseases. Sexual abuses can result to infection and diseases. It could result to psychological trauma. For example, a person that is being raped, of course we have that trauma for a long time, if not for the rest of his or her life. So it could result to psychological trauma. It could result to depression. Some people will go through a form of abuse that they won't be able to say it out. Rather, they will keep holding it on, and they will be getting depressed day by day. It could lead to hatred. The victims eventually develop a kind of hatred to the perpetrator of such violence. So you understand, those are the effects that abuses, domestic violence, for example, sexual abuses, violence against persons generally can have on people. Come again, could result to hospitalization, could result to death, it could result to infections and diseases, it could result to depression, it could result to psychological trauma, and of course it could result to hatred. The victim will in turn hate the perpetrator of the violence on him or her. So now, the law protects people generally from violent acts. We have, for protection of people from violence acts, we have several laws that have been enacted which aims at protecting individuals from domestic violence. And one law that stands out is the Violence Against Persons Prohibition Act. We call it VAP Act of 2015. Violence Against Persons Prohibition Act, VAP Act of 2015. And of course, Kwara State, for example, has domesticated it. Kwara State government has domesticated the law. So we now have what we call VAP law of Kwara State, the Violence Against Persons Prohibition Law of Kwara State. The main thrust of this law is to eliminate violence in private and public life. This law prohibits all forms of violence against persons, particularly women and girls who are, disproportionately affected. We all know that women and girls are mostly at a disadvantage when it comes to all these violent acts. So, of course, women are disproportionately affected. So this VAP law and VAP Act, aims at, guiding and protecting particularly women and girls from violence. The VAP law provides maximum protection and effective remedies for victims, and it also provides a punishment for offenders. Punishment can range from damages to compensation to jail time, depending on the offense committed. So punishment can be that because we award damages or compensation. In some cases, it could be jail time. For example, rape, it will be jail time. And depending on the offenses, the punishment ranges. And do you even know that a person who incites somebody or aids a person or abets or cancels another person to commit an act of violence is also guilty of an offense under the VAP Act. So we should all be careful of the kind of counsel we give people around us. We've seen cases where probably a husband is abusing the spouse. Some friends will be, encouraging the husband to do such violence act on the wife. You can also be found guilty of an offense when you incite somebody, or you aid the person, or you abet the person, or you counsel that person to commit an act of violence. You could also be guilty of an offense under the VAP Act. So we should all be careful, like I said, of the kind of counsel we give to people around us. Now, I want to give us some tips on some things you probably did not know that are offenses under the VAP Act, or which can land you in trouble. Some things that you just be thinking that you're just doing is not a big deal, but that can seriously land you in trouble. Before I go into this, I want you to sit back, relax, as we're going to go on a short break now, and we'll be right back. Welcome back to Legal Clues on Emirate Radio, and as you know, on Legal Clues we give you legal tips on the things you need to know, to be aware and abreast of, to have and to live a crime-free life, and also to be able to make informed decisions in life, decisions that will not land you in trouble. And today we are talking on violence against persons, particularly women and children. And for the purpose of people just joining us, we have talked about the forms of violence that can be perpetrated against women and children in particular. It could also be perpetrated against any other person, probably a man, but today we are just basing our discussion on women and children. Now, we have talked about domestic violence, we have talked about sexual abuse or harassment, we have talked about physical abuse. And as you know, we have talked about the types of violence that we have. We have said that violence could take the physical form, sexual form, and psychological form. Violence on person, physically beating and assaulting somebody. Sexual violence, having carnal knowledge of somebody without the person's consent, or touching somebody inappropriately without the person's consent. And also psychological violence. Some people will not inflict bodily injury upon you. They won't beat you. They won't have carnal knowledge of you without your consent. But some will talk down on you to the extent that you begin to, get depressed, and it will affect your mental health and your psychology. You understand? So we have psychological violence too, where you talk down on somebody. You touch on the emotion of the person to be able to to bring the person down, and gradually sometimes result into depression. So we have talked about these forms of violence, and now we want to talk about tips. Some tips, them things that the VAP Act I mentioned earlier provided for as offenses that people just do and they don't even know are offenses. The first one is where you willfully place a person in fear of physical injury. You didn't even inflict the physical injury on that person, but you have willfully placed that person in fear of that physical injury. It's an offense that attracts 2 years jail term or a fine of 200,000 under the VAP Act. So, in case you don't know, when you think you just want to, want the person to maintain and the person to respect himself, and you just put that person in unnecessary fear of inflicting bodily or physical injury in that person, that is an offense. If you don't know, another offense is when you coerce somebody to engage in any act to the detriment of that other person's physical or psychological well-being. That is also an offense. Some things that you do that you don't even know that could constitute an offense, but they are actually offenses under the law. And as you know, that like the popular saying, ignorance is not an excuse under the law. Another thing you might not know is when you inflict physical injury on a person by means of any weapon, substance, or object is an offense that attracts 5 years jail term or a fine of 100,000 under the VAP Act. Another offense is forcefully evicting your spouse from your home or denying your spouse access to your home. That is an offense that attracts 2 years jail term or a fine of 300,000. There are some men that when their wife probably comes home late, they'll be like, go back to where you're coming from. Some will lock their spouses out. It is an offense for you to forcefully evict your spouse out of the house when it's not as if you have probably done your divorce and the person is moving out. When you forcefully evict your spouse from your house or you deny that spouse access to the house, it attracts 2 years jail time. It is an offense under the law. So, you men should be careful. Sending your wives out and ungodly hours sometimes, it's an offense. Sometimes when you cause financial dependence or economic abuse on another person, it's an offense that attracts 2 year jail term or a fine of 500,000. So for some men that will, insist that their wives must not work, and of course they are not ready to take proper financial responsibilities of the wife and of her upkeep, it's a violence against that wife. For you to insist that your wife will not work and you are not ready to bear the financial obligation on that your spouse, it is an offense, a violent act against that spouse. Also causing emotional, verbal, or psychological abuse on another person. Sometimes, like I said earlier in this discussion, some people will not physically assault, they won't beat the person, but they will talk. They will, talk down that person, verbally abuse the person, emotionally abuse the person, psychologically abuse the person. It is an offense because a violent act against that person you're abusing. Also, subjecting a widow to harmful traditional practices is an act of violence and attracts 2 years imprisonment or fine of 500,000. You understand? You have some cultures that will subject the widows, probably a woman that lost her husband. They will subject them to some harmful traditional practices. It is a violent act against such widow, and of course, it is an offense. Also, abandonment of your spouse, your children, and other dependents without any means of sustenance is an act of violence that attracts 3 years imprisonment or 500,000 naira. Another offense is when you stalk another person. Stalking another person is an offense that attracts 2 years jail term or a fine of 500,000. So in case you don't know, you just think you are stalking, you don't know it is an offense. It is an offense because it is considered a violent act against the person you are stalking. Also, a person who batters his or her spouse, of course we have said that earlier, commits an offense that is liable to 3 years imprisonment or a fine of 200,000 naira. All these that I've mentioned are acts of violence. They are not limited to this. We still have a lot of other actions that constitute violence against persons, particularly women and children, that you probably would not know that they are offenses, but they are. And of course, ignorance is not an excuse, like I said before the law. So when you do something and you say you don't know they are offenses, doesn't mean that you will not be found guilty, and doesn't mean that you will not pay dearly for the consequences of your actions. There are other acts that constitutes violence against persons. We probably may not be able to mention them for want of time, but we just want you to know some of these actions that can land you in trouble as they constitute violence against persons. So We are bringing this topic to you to let you know that it is important to desist or refrain from causing harm or violence on another person, whether family member, whether friends, whether acquaintances, whether anybody. All of us need to desist or refrain from causing harm or violence on another person. We need to be humane, bearing in mind that there are grave, sometimes it could be mild and sometimes it could be grave, but there are consequences for our actions. And for all your actions, you will bear the consequences alone. Nobody will want to hear that you didn't know that it constitutes an offense and that's why you did it. You will bear the consequences for your actions. So let us together stop violence against our fellow humans and let us live peacefully together. It is important to be humane. It is important to be good. It is important to be kind to one another, particularly spouses. If you are going through any form of abuse or if you are the abuser, it is important to retrace your step. As the abuser, it is important to retrace your step so as not, to be found wanting under the law. And as the person being abused, if it is a physical one, it is always better to live, like we always say. You should get out of toxic relationships that can take your life. You should get out of toxic marriages that can cause you death. And until next week, where we'll have to come again to talk about another juicy legal topic, we want you to know that it's important to be human, refrain from crime, and let's all be good citizens of Nigeria. God bless us all. Have a blessed and fulfilling day ahead of you.
Are you a business owner? Emirate Radio gives the opportunity for infant organization and commercials for advertisement and publicity on our varieties of shows and update for the growth and expansion of your commodity. Grab your opportunity today by sending a mail to info@emirateradio.ng. Call 0913 4158 376 or 0806 134 6946. Visit Emirate Radio House behind Federal Ministry of Environment off Old Jebba Road, Ilorin, Kwara State, Nigeria. Emirate Radio, the voice of the people.